A little over a month ago, I looked at 5 former Alliance of American Football League players that were still playing in spring football in the United Football League. And now, a month later, it is time to look at 5 more Alliance of American Football League players to United Football League players. The first player we're going to look at today is going to be Frank Gidna, linebacker, San Diego Fleet to the Michigan Panthers. Now, with his time in the Fleet, Gidna is not the player that we know him as today. Now, with the Fleet, he was still a solid player, ended up finishing tied for 20th in total tackles at 37 across 8 games on a San Diego Fleet team that would finish 3-5 before the season ended up being stopped. The Fleet were a team that was still technically in the playoff race, though they needed to have a lot of things go right for them. But Gidna would become a spring football legend with his time in the USFL and the Michigan Panthers. That's because in the 2 years he played there, he was incredible. Now, while he did have a stop with the New York Guardians in the 2020 XFL, his time with the Panthers is where he became a spring football legend. In 2022, he was one of the tackle leaders with 90 total tackles, and then followed that up with a 104 USFL leading total tackles. That same year, he would be an all-USFL player, as well as being the USFL Defensive Player of the Year. Gidna was easily the best player in the league on defense that year, being a huge reason why the Michigan Panthers would end up making it to the playoffs for the first time in the modern era. As for his time in the UFL this past season, it did have one downside: injuries. Now, he ended up playing in 6 total games, having 36 tackles, which wasn't nearly as good as he was in 2023, but he was still a very important player for the Michigan Panthers, as he still ended up being one of the team's tackle leaders despite only playing 6 games. But an injury took his season out prematurely, as he would end up missing the last 4 weeks of the season, and also missed the postseason game against the Birmingham Stallions. There is a huge what if on what if he was healthy for that playoff game, as until the end of the third quarter it was a tight-knit game, and having someone like Gidna could have made the difference. Now, Frank that year still was a huge help, as he was a huge reason why the defense was so good. Kai Nacua and Breland Speaks both had breakout years, despite Speaks already having a great one in 23, which led to Speaks winning DPOY, and a huge reason for that is because of having Frank Gidna around, being that leader of the team. Again, it'll be interesting to see if he does return in 2025, but he is a spring football legend, and he is not the only linebacker we are talking about today, but the next player we're going to talk about is going to be Chris Odom. Chris Odom, defensive end from the Salt Lake Stallions to the Houston Roughnecks. Now, Odom is definitely an incredible case of a just weird spring football career in a good way. Now, his time with the Salt Lake Stallions was an overall solid performance, tied for 21st in sacks with 2.5 and 10 total tackles. Again, just like Gidna, he was not the player we know him as today, as back then he was still a solid player, but not a superstar. Again, the Salt Lake Stallions were not a great team, 3-5, just like the Fleet, barely had a shot to make it to the playoffs. Hard to tell if they would for sure. But as for Chris Odom, it's what he did just like Gidna in the USFL. In 2022, Chris Odom had what is still arguably the greatest spring football season in the modern era. 12.5 total sacks in a 10-game season. 41 total tackles as an edge rusher, while having around 4 blocked kicks as well. His season was insane. 6 forced fumbles. It was otherworldly. There is a legit argument that if the Gamblers had been a playoff team, he would have been MVP over KaVontae Turpin, who ended up getting the award being on a 9-1 Generals team. Chris Odom was insane that year. But sadly, when he went to the Cleveland Browns to have another NFL opportunity, he would end up tearing his ACL in the preseason, missing the entire year, and would miss the 2023 spring football season as well. But his return was really, really good. The 2024 Houston Roughnecks were the most disappointing defensive line in the entire league. The D-line was supposed to be an incredible group filled with a ton of insanely talented players, but every single one of them underperformed, except Chris Odom. Chris Odom still managed to have 5.5 sacks, which was good enough for 6th in the league, 8 TFLs and 2 forced fumbles, and was an all-UFL defender, being one of the very few players to be an all-league player on 2 separate occasions. He was insane for the Roughnecks, being the best player on defense, and as I said, the only edge rusher / pass rusher in general that lived up to all the hype he had. Again, the Houston Roughnecks, though, were a bad team, finishing 1-9, with a huge reason being their defense not being nearly as good as we expected it to be. But it wasn't because of Odom. Odom was still an incredible player and was great. And as for the next linebacker we were going to talk about, it is Scooby Wright, Arizona Hotshots to the Birmingham Stallions. Now, Scooby Wright with the Arizona Hotshots a team that was 5-3 and was looking to be a playoff team if they just won one more game, or the Fleet and Stallions both lost one more. He was not as good as Gidna in his time in the AAF. In the 7 games he played in, he only had 22 total tackles. But just like the past 2 players we've talked about, it was what happened in the USFL that made him into such a legend. The college football legend, the guy who won a ton of awards back in 2014 for Arizona, his time with the Stallions was legendary, with one iconic moment above them all. In the 2022 USFL Championship game, he would have a pick 6 that would essentially be the game-clinching pick 6. It is one of the most iconic moments in modern spring football history, and it capped off a really solid season for him, where he ended up having 52 total tackles, as well as having 3 sacks that year. Now, sadly, after that, injuries did end up having a huge factor in him. The next 2 seasons he would not play an entire season in either year, deal with a ton of injuries, and his overall tackles numbers dwindled because of that to 6 and 7. It looks like his career is probably over, though never say never, as some would say, as he did put up pictures that said he was retiring, but it's not fully official. It's kind of a weird thing. He is a 3-time champion in spring football thanks to being on the Birmingham Stallions, and if his career is for sure over, it was a run, as again, he still has one of the most iconic moments in spring football history. And now to end it off, we're going to look at a pair of tight ends, with the first one being Wes Saxton, Birmingham Iron to the Memphis Showboats. Last time we talked about his teammate Braden Bowman, and today it's time to talk about him. Now, Wes with the Iron was a very solid player for them. Despite being a tight end, he would end up having 17 receptions for over 240 yards. He did only have 1 touchdown, but the 240 yards as a tight end in only 6 games is very impressive, as having 40 yards per game is really, really solid. Again, the Birmingham Iron were a good team. They were 5-3 and did clinch a playoff spot. The Luis Perez, Trent Richardson team was a really solid offense, and he was a huge reason why that offense was as good as it was. Now, after that, he would end up going to the New Jersey Generals and the Memphis Showboats. Now, across the 3 next years of spring football that he played in those 3 years, he really didn't do a ton. The fact is, the Generals, he didn't really do a lot for that team. The 2022 Generals especially were basically just Cavante Turpin and the running game. And then in 2023, he did get some more time, but he only got 6 receptions for 70 yards. And in 2024, with the Memphis Showboats, he would only have 1 reception for 11 yards. And the Memphis Showboats were an abysmal team, with the only 2 wins coming against the Houston Roughnecks. So sadly, Saxton's time in the UFL and USFL was not as good as it was in the AAF, being the opposite of what happened to the previous 3 players we talked about. And finally, it is time to talk about Marcus Baugh, tight end, San Diego Fleet, to the Birmingham Stallions. Now, Wes Saxton was a very solid player with the AAF. Now, again, just like Saxton, he did have over 200 yards. Now, he did play in 8 total games and only had 13 receptions, but his 16 yards per reception was a really solid number, and he did have 2 touchdowns. He wasn't as good as Saxton in the AAF, but he would make up for that with his time in the Michigan Panthers. With the Panthers, he would end up having over 100 yards in both seasons, being a very reliable tight end for the team. He was not a superstar by any means, but he was a very solid player that could be relied upon. His 1 touchdown in 2022, and then 2 touchdowns in 2023. Again, a very solid player for the Panthers. He was not a superstar, again, just like in the AAF, he was just a solid tight end to have on your roster. And then this past year in 2024, he was a part of the championship Birmingham Stallions, where he would end up having 4 receptions for 76 yards across the season. Now, the Birmingham Stallions famously had Jay Sternberger, who was just otherworldly the past couple of years, and they had Jordan Thomas, who ended up having some crazy catches during the back half of the season and the postseason. So Baugh was kind of put in that third role where he wasn't really talked about or seen a ton, but he was still a very solid player. And that'll do it. This was 5 more AAF to UFL players. If you want to see another one, let me know down in the comments below. And next time, if you guys do want one, I might do something a bit different, as there are a lot of coaches and executives that have gone from the AAF to the UFL. So if you want to see that, make sure to like the video and comment down below. If you've been a fan of the channel, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. We do at least 2 videos a week during the UFL offseason. And as always, guys, have a great night.